Shangguan Wan'er, written upon imperial command to match a poem by the emperor, presenting coloured paper-cut flowers at a royal banquet in the inner palace on the establishing spring day. Dense leaves come into bloom from trimming. New flowers unroll from cutting. Even though you are not mistaken by pulling on a branch, you unexpectedly discover the flaw when plucking a bud. From the time when spring comes, flowers start to bloom. In autumn, they are still unwilling to wither. May I ask the blossoms of peaches and plums, what would happen if I mix paper and real flowers together? So, this is the second poem we've read of Shangguan Wan'er, and we introduced all the background information you need about her in the previous poem. Just suffice it to say, she's an early Tang female poet and a courtier, which means her poetry is, very, very, very typical of what we would expect of the early Tang period and of a courtier. In fact, her poetry falls, as we mentioned in that video, into three baskets. On the one hand, there is landscape poetry, which is a tradition that flourished in the period of the Six Dynasties. In the case of Early Tang and of Shangguan Wan'er, this usually takes the form of descriptions of estates of the aristocracy or of the imperial family. A second basket, and today's poem falls into it, are poems made at imperial command. So this is court poetry at its most courtliest. And again, this was especially typical of the Six Dynasties. So Six Dynasties poetry is aristocratic. It's very, very conventional on subject matter and on diction. And then it's an insider type of poetry that you can only really know how to make without breaking any of the rules if you are an aristocrat working at the court. It's also a very superficial and vacuous type of poetry, always good feelings, nice words, nothing unusual, nothing too complex, because a lot of these poems are expected to be composed extemporaneously on the command of the emperor. So like in the imperial court, there are many celebrations, parties, events at which the emperor would commingle with his courtiers, and he would ask his courtiers to compose a poem, maybe one sharing the rhymes of a poem that he had composed, maybe one sharing the topic that the emperor had composed, or maybe with complete indifference of whether the emperor had composed a poem or not. Just there's a festivity today, a spring festivity or an autumn festivity, and the emperor commands some scholars to compose poems to celebrate the event. So always auspicious, superficial, light sort of poetry. And this poem that we've read today fits into that framework. Finally, there is a last type of poems that Shangguan Wan'er also indulges in, which are the boudoir style poetry, which is poems of lonely concubines and empresses in the secluded quarters of the imperial palace, languishing at the lack of their beloved. So the early Tang poetry continues. This is Stephen Owen's thesis in his book, The Early Tang. The early Tang poem continues very, 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 very strictly with most of the subject matter, topic, characteristics of Six Dynasties poetry. It's also interesting to know that Japanese classical poetry, the one of the Kokinshu and of the early Waka tradition, takes its inspiration from precisely the sort of early Tang Six Dynasties aristocratic and auspicious and superficial sort of verse making. So, having said that, let's go back to this poem. So this poem has a really, really long title, but basically its context is presumably a ceremony that takes place in the early spring of 709 in the court. There's a gathering of palace ladies who present paper-cut blossoms to commemorate the spring to Emperor Chongzong. And the emperor, as usual, commands some academicians and Shangguan Wan'er to write poems for the occasion. So to this paper flower cutting palace activity, it's a pretty routine court ritual. So the topic of the poem is describing this activity, always with an auspicious and positive tone and a very, very subdued, refined, and flattering content. And, as we said, this poem is pretty stereotypical of this sort of poetry from the early Tang. Its translator, who is either Shuebai or Masha Kopzeva, comment that her agile language in the original adds an erotic dimension by enlivening paper flowers and personifying plants. So it's a little bit better than the staple fare of court poems. Let's take a look at it, as usual, couplet by couplet. This is not a regulated poem. Regulated poetry really comes into being in the High Tang, even though you can find examples that are approximating its tonal, metrical line requirements earlier. In fact, this poem, if you look at it in the Chinese characters, it's 8 lines and pentasyllabic, so it looks like a liu shi, and it has some parallelism in the middle, at least in the third couplet, I think. But yeah, it's not a regulated poem. First couplet. Dense leaves come into bloom from trimming. New flowers unroll from cutting. So the title already made explicit that we are in a context in the palace in which courtiers, ladies, are probably cutting beautiful pieces of colorful paper to make flowers and to make leaves. And first couplet is telling us this. Yeah? The dense leaves come into bloom from trimming, not from natural outgrowth. New flowers unroll, but from cutting, from bending the papers and cutting with some sort of scissors, I imagine. Second couplet. Even though you are not mistaken by pulling on a branch, you unexpectedly discover the flaw when plucking a bud. So I had more difficulty understanding this couplet. You are not mistaken by pulling on a branch, presumably because you're not... when you see these paper flowers, you're not seeing a tree, a fake tree made out of them. So when you're not deceived into not detecting their false nature because you're pulling them from a branch, but you are deceived because you might just see one of them, one of these branches with fake branches with leaves and flowers, and you might try to pluck a bud out and notice, oh wait, this is made of paper. This is what the Japanese, I suspect, called in their equivalent waka poetry mitate, or elegant confusion. There's this idea that you confuse maybe snowflakes falling on an early spring plum tree with the plum blossoms itself. And of course, it's ridiculous. No one would confuse the real with the imaginary, but it's a conceit, if you want, an artificial, funny, playful juxtaposition and suspension of disbelief that, it sounds well in the poem as a piece of flattery, like the work of these courtiers making these paper flowers and leaves is so well done that, it might deceive the sight of an innocent onlooker. Third couplet. From the time when spring comes, flowers start to bloom. In autumn, they are still unwilling to wither. So this couplet makes a reference to the seasons, but it's a paradoxical one because, again, we are juxtaposing the real flowers with the seasonal flowers. So in real life, with spring, blooms come. Here, with spring, the real blooms and the artificial blooms come. They start to bloom. When autumn comes, of course, the real ones will have been long gone. But these paper flowers are unwilling to wither. They are more stable. They're more long-lasting. And finally, the poem ends with, what we can only call a rhetorical question. May I ask the blossoms of peaches or plums, what would happen if I mix paper and real flowers together? So peaches and plums are favorite trees and favorite flowers in a lot of classical Chinese poetry. So the poet ends up with this rhetorical firework saying, imagining a context in which she directs herself to the trees and say, hey, my flowers, the paper flowers, the artificial ones, have their advantages as well. They're more long-lasting than yours. Now, wouldn't it be nice if we could merge them together and put them in the same tree, perhaps. So that's it for today. An elegant, light piece that really exemplifies well the type of court-style poetry of the early Tang.